20 minutes before the Meridian Aurora's grand unveiling, the most expensive electric prototype Brooks Meridian Motors had ever built sat completely silent inside a glass-walled garage in downtown Detroit. 12 engineers had already failed. The shareholders were already seated, the international press had already gone live, and the clock on the lobby screen was counting down in full view of everyone who mattered. Coulter Briggs, a single father in a faded, oil-stained jacket, arrived in a battered pickup truck with his 8-year-old daughter at his side, called in at the last possible moment by someone desperate enough to try anything. He studied the red fault code on the dashboard display and quietly asked everyone in the garage to step away from the vehicle. Garrett Holloway called him a fraud before he finished the sentence. Delaney Brooks looked at him the way powerful people look at things they consider beneath them, and said flatly, "Get him out." Coulter stood still. He looked at the car one final time, and he said, "Kick me out, and this car won't start again. Don't walk away, because this car isn't broken. It's guarding a secret that could bring down Delaney's entire empire." The Brooks Meridian Motors headquarters stood on the eastern edge of Detroit's revitalized industrial corridor, a building designed to project confidence even when the company felt none. The glass-walled underground garage had been converted into a private presentation theater for the evening, draped in dark fabric and lit with the kind of precise architectural lighting that cost more per hour than most mechanics earned in a week. At the center of it all sat the Meridian Aurora, a sleek, silver-black electric prototype with a curved body that looked like something drawn by a person who had never accepted the word impossible, and it was completely, stubbornly, humiliatingly dead. No engine response, no dashboard initialization, no soft startup chime from the sequence that the engineering team had rehearsed 50 times in the weeks leading to this night. The vehicle simply sat there, locked in a deep sleep state that no one on the 12-person team had managed to crack in 3 hours of increasingly desperate attempts. Delaney Brooks stood at the edge of the floor with her arms crossed, watching her engineers with the controlled stillness that people who are genuinely frightened learn to wear on their faces. She was 36 years old and had spent 11 of those years building Brooks Meridian from a mid-tier regional brand into a company that the automotive world had started to take seriously, and tonight was supposed to justify every sacrifice she had made. The Meridian Aurora was not simply a car. It was the answer to 2 years of hostile acquisition pressure, a demonstration that Brooks Meridian could compete at the highest level without being absorbed by conglomerates that kept sending offers written in the politely threatening language of people who expected her to eventually say yes. If the Aurora launched successfully, the company's valuation would rise, the acquisition pressure would ease, and Delaney would walk out having earned her position on her own terms. If the car stayed silent, Garrett Holloway would have precisely the ammunition he needed to go to the board and argue that she had lost control of her most important project. Garrett Holloway stood near the far wall, speaking quietly into his phone with the unhurried ease of a man who had already decided how the evening was going to end. As vice president of operations, he had occupied the second most powerful role in the building for 7 years, watching Delaney's decisions with the particular patience of someone who believes that waiting is the same as winning. He had personally overseen the final software integration phase of the Aurora project, and yet here they were, 52 minutes before the scheduled reveal, with 12 engineers, a dead car, and a room full of people pretending not to panic. Cassidy Monroe, Delaney's chief of staff, had already worked through 3 calls to outside technical contacts and received 3 polite versions of unavailability. On the 4th call, a former colleague from her engineering days mentioned a name she wrote on a notepad, hesitated over for nearly a minute, and then carried across the floor to Delaney. Delaney looked at the name, looked at the motionless prototype, and agreed to the call with the expression of someone choosing between two bad options. Coulter Briggs arrived 17 minutes later in a pickup truck that had clearly been repainted at least once and was never going to be mistaken for anything that belonged in a facility like this one. He was 40 years old, broad-shouldered, with hands that had clearly been doing actual mechanical work rather than theoretical engineering for some years, and he came accompanied by his daughter Lydia, 8 years old, carrying a small backpack decorated with hand-drawn stars, because her school day had ended 2 hours ago and there was no one else available to watch her. The sight of the two of them walking into that garage produced a visible and immediate reaction in the room. Whitney Boone, the company's director of communications, made a quiet remark to the person nearest her about how Cassidy had apparently called a roadside mechanic instead of a qualified engineer, the kind of remark calibrated to be heard by just enough people to pass as consensus. Delaney said nothing, but her expression shifted in a way that Cassidy recognized and did not like. Coulter did not react to any of it. He walked to the vehicle, set down his toolbox without ceremony, and asked, quietly without urgency, to see the dashboard diagnostic output and the startup log. What followed over the next 4 minutes was not drama in the form that a room full of tense people typically expected drama to take. Coulter did not make urgent sounds or call for specialized equipment or deliver a rapid technical monologue designed to signal expertise. He simply looked. He read through the startup log with the concentrated attention of someone reviewing data they recognized, not as a student working through unfamiliar material, but as a person encountering something that had once been part of their own thinking. After perhaps 4 minutes, he straightened up and said, in a tone that was entirely conversational, that the problem was not in the battery management system or the drive motor or any of the hardware components the team had spent 3 hours testing. The vehicle was locked in a deep sleep safety state because its core security sequence had detected a discrepancy it could not resolve, and it would remain locked until the discrepancy was corrected or the original authentication chain was restored. 12 engineers who had been working on the wrong answer for 3 hours said nothing. Delaney was not in the mood for lengthy explanations. She had been awake since 4 in the morning. She was managing pressure from 2 acquisition groups simultaneously, and the countdown visible through the glass wall at the top of the garage stairs was no longer abstract. She asked Coulter one direct question: could he fix it? He said yes, but doing it properly required full access to the system's security log and the complete software update history, including the version control records that Garrett Holloway had been managing as part of the integration phase. The request arrived in the room like a stone dropped into standing water. Garrett moved away from the wall almost immediately, his voice carrying the smooth, unreachable certainty of someone accustomed to having objections accepted without follow-up, explaining that Coulter was an outside contractor without clearance to access proprietary prototype data. Whitney added that a person who had brought a child into a secured technical facility was clearly not operating at the level the situation required. Coulter looked at Whitney without expression, then looked back at the car. Lydia stood a few feet behind him, close enough to hear everything and old enough to understand more of it than the adults in the room would have expected. Coulter said again, evenly, that the system was not malfunctioning. It was behaving correctly. Something had attempted to alter the core protection sequence, and the vehicle's own architecture had recognized the intrusion and shut itself down, rather than allow a compromised version of itself to run. That was not a defect. That was the system doing exactly what it was built to do. The temperature in the room shifted slightly, the way it does when a simple statement contains more information than the people hearing it know immediately how to process. Delaney's first instinct was to read this as technically worded stalling. The kind of language contractors sometimes deployed when they needed more time, more money, or both. She turned to her lead engineer and asked for his assessment. He said, choosing his words carefully, that he couldn't rule out what the outside technician was describing. Delaney told her team to keep working. She told Coulter his services were no longer required. He began gathering his tools without argument, moving with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had long stopped being surprised by decisions like this one. Lydia watched the faces of the people in the room with the attentiveness of a child who has learned to measure a situation by how adults move rather than what they say. Coulter lifted his toolbox and picked up his jacket from the edge of the workbench. He was within a few steps of the door when he stopped, turned back, and looked at Delaney Brooks with the expression of someone delivering a fact. What he said would be repeated in various forms in every account of that evening for years afterward. "Kick me out," he said, "and this car won't start again." The garage went quiet for a beat that lasted slightly longer than it should have. Delaney's jaw tightened. She told him he did not get to use her vehicle as a bargaining chip. He said, without raising his voice, that he was not threatening her, he was warning her. She had already stopped listening. She told security to escort him from the premises. Coulter took Lydia's hand and walked out without looking back. The garage was quieter after Coulter left, but not calmer. The lead engineer ran through the emergency restart protocol with the thoroughness of someone fully expecting it to succeed and deeply unsettled when it didn't. Every command the team entered prompted the same sequence. The system registered the input, began the initialization chain, and then locked down further than before, as though repeated unauthorized attempts were being logged and interpreted as escalating intrusion. The dashboard displayed a single line of red text that none of the engineers had encountered in any training, simulation, or prior diagnostic session. Unauthorized core sequence. The message required no elaboration. It offered none. Garrett Holloway watched this unfold from his position near the wall with the composed neutrality of a man who had known the demonstration would fail before anyone else suspected it. He had overseen the final software update 3 nights before the launch, working late with a contractor whose credentials Cassidy had tried twice to verify and been told both times that access had been pre-authorized at the operations level. He had pushed the integration timeline faster than the engineering team recommended, citing competitive pressure and the credible suggestion that arrival was close to a comparable announcement. His reasoning had sounded entirely rational. It had been designed to. Whitney Boone had her crisis communications draft ready before the engineers completed their 3rd failed attempt, framing the delay as a precautionary measure driven by Brooks Meridian's safety commitment, language that conveyed responsibility while communicating nothing accurate. Cassidy Monroe had been quietly reviewing the security footage from before Coulter's arrival. When she found what she was looking for, she went still. In the footage from 22 minutes before Coulter walked through the door, she watched his eyes track directly to the location of the core lock controller, a component behind a secondary panel not labeled on any schematic visible from that angle. He hadn't looked confused. He had looked like a person who already knew exactly what was there. That was not how a mechanic examined an unfamiliar system. Cassidy opened the contractor referral file and began reading it with the attention she should have applied before making the call. She brought what she had found to Delaney and said, with the directness that was her professional signature, that Coulter should be called back. Delaney's response was a silence that communicated, precisely, how uncomfortable she found this. She had stood in front of her entire engineering staff, her security team, her communications director, and a small child, and she had told this man to leave. Calling him back, making that call with his daughter presumably still sitting in the truck, and his toolbox presumably still on the passenger seat, required a form of self-correction that Delaney did not have much practice performing. She was not accustomed to being publicly wrong. She was significantly less accustomed to acknowledging it. The clock, visible through the glass wall, showed 45 minutes. The shareholders were upstairs in the reception area, conducting the careful, non-committal small talk of people who were not yet sure whether to be excited or anxious. The prototype sat in the center of the floor, immaculate and inert, like a very expensive argument that had not yet been resolved. Delaney put her palm flat against the car's hood. The metal was cold. For the first time since Coulter had left the building, she permitted herself to consider that he had been telling the truth. The phone number was in the contractor file. Delaney dialed it herself without asking Cassidy to make the call on her behalf, which was the smallest and most meaningful decision she made that evening. It rang 4 times before a young voice answered, careful, polite, clearly practiced at taking messages, and told her that her father was currently driving. Delaney experienced the particular discomfort of someone who had rarely encountered gentle resistance and now found herself navigating it from an 8-year-old. She asked, in a tone that came out slightly more clipped than she intended, whether Lydia could pass the phone to her father. A moment passed. The sound through the phone suggested a vehicle slowing, and then Coulter's voice came on, unhurried, entirely unsurprised. He asked whether the car had started. There was no satisfaction in the question, which was harder to absorb than contempt would have been. Delaney said nothing for 3 seconds, which was enough to answer without words. Coulter said the system would continue to deepen its lockdown with each incorrect authentication attempt, and that by this point the team had likely triggered 4 or 5 additional security layers that would need to be resolved in the correct sequence before the vehicle responded to anything. Delaney told him, choosing her words with the precision of someone who had spent years projecting authority under pressure, that the company required his expertise and would compensate him appropriately for returning. There was a brief silence. Then Coulter said, without inflection and without cruelty, "The company didn't send me away. You did." That sentence was not a speech. It was not a demand. It was simply accurate, and its accuracy was precisely what made it land the way it did. What followed was not the kind of polished apology she had given in board meetings and press statements, constructed with precision and zero genuine discomfort. She said she had made a judgment based on appearance and assumption rather than evidence, and that she had done it in front of his daughter, and that both of those things had been wrong. The words came out in a slightly rougher order than she would have preferred. Coulter did not respond immediately, which meant she had to sit with what she had said for a moment, longer than felt comfortable. He told her he would return under 2 conditions. No one, including Garrett Holloway, was permitted to interact with the vehicle's software before he reviewed the complete update history, and if he found evidence of deliberate interference, Delaney would commit to disclosing that publicly rather than directing blame toward lower-level technical staff. There was nothing unreasonable about either condition, which was what made them harder to accept than demands that overreached would have been. The first was a question of access. The second was a question of character. Delaney could have pushed back. She chose not to. She said she understood, and that both conditions would be met. Coulter said he would turn around. Before the call ended, Lydia's voice was briefly audible in the background, asking her father what the lady had said. He told her they were going back to look at the car. She said, "Okay, good." Coulter returned to Brooks Meridian through the main entrance, not the service access point at the east end of the building where contractors typically checked in. This was Delaney's instruction, passed to the front desk before his truck reached the lot, and it was noticed by everyone in the garage who had watched him leave through a side door 30 minutes earlier. Small distinctions carry significant meaning in corporate environments. and the difference between a service entrance and a main entrance is never merely logistical. The security officer who had escorted Coulter out the first time was now positioned at the lobby door and opened it without a word. Cassidy met him at the elevator. Delaney was waiting at the top of the garage stairs. She did not extend a hand or produce a formal welcome, but she did something that cost more than either would have. She crouched to Lydia's eye level and spoke to the girl directly, saying she had behaved poorly by allowing people to say unkind things about her father where Lydia could hear them, and that she was sorry. Lydia considered this with the evaluating calm of a child who understood that an apology means more when something was required to give it. She then asked, with complete directness, whether Delaney was going to let her father actually fix the car this time. Delaney said yes. Lydia said okay, and settled into the chair Cassidy had placed near the wall, with a small cup of juice and a notebook. Coulter did not go to the engine first. He went to the data, which was what the situation actually required, and that the distinction was one the 12 engineers had missed because they had been trained to address the symptom rather than locate the origin. He asked for the software update log, the access history for the core security module, and the original architecture file from the development phase. The first two arrived quickly. The third took longer than it should have because the request had to pass through Garrett, who introduced an 8-minute delay by citing archived server retrieval, a delay that arrived with an explanation smooth enough to be rehearsed. When the file came, Coulter placed it beside the live diagnostics on the tablet and began comparing sequences with the focused patience of someone reading a document they had partially written themselves. Garrett watched from across the floor with the measured expression of a man waiting for the right moment to step in. When Coulter requested the full update log rather than the condensed version that had been sent, Garrett said, with the reasonable assurance that was his professional default, that the condensed version contained all relevant data and that retrieving the full record would consume time that did not exist. Coulter said, without looking up from the screen, that a missing timestamp range in the authentication chain was precisely the kind of gap that allowed a core override to proceed undetected, and that skipping it risked a vehicle that would start for 3 minutes on stage and then lock down permanently in front of every camera in the building, which was, he noted, considerably worse than not starting at all. Garrett did not respond immediately. Delaney told him to provide the full log. Garrett sent a version that arrived quickly enough to suggest prior preparation, but Coulter identified the authentication gap within 40 seconds of opening it. The timestamp excision was clean. It required someone with admin-level credentials and the specific knowledge of which records to remove. Cassidy watched Garrett's face throughout and observed that when Coulter named the gap, Garrett did not look surprised. He looked like someone monitoring the direction of a conversation. Coulter connected his personal diagnostic device, a unit that looked built in a workshop rather than purchased from a catalog, to the vehicle's secondary port. When the core architecture populated the screen, he went still, not with confusion, with recognition. He said, after a pause long enough to register, that he needed to tell Delaney something about where this system came from. Garrett shifted his weight. Whitney reached for her phone. Delaney told Whitney to put it away, told Garrett to stay where he was, then walked to Coulter's side and said quietly that he should go ahead. What followed was not a narrative constructed for effect. It was a factual account, delivered by someone who had been carrying it for a long time without expectation that it would ever matter to anyone but himself. Approximately 7 years earlier, Coulter and his wife Tessa had developed a core safety lock architecture for high-end electric vehicles built around one governing principle. A vehicle that detected its own protective software had been tampered with should refuse to operate, because a car whose security layer could be remotely accessed after compromise was not a vehicle but a liability someone else controlled. They filed the foundational patent through a small firm they established together, spent 2 years building the architecture, and were in early discussions with manufacturers when Tessa's illness progressed faster than either of them had prepared for. A larger technology group eventually purchased the rights to a portion of the work through a transaction that Von Mercer had raised formal objections to at the time, objections that had been documented and then strategically ignored. Delaney listened to this without visible expression, which was not the same as listening without processing. She was placing everything Coulter said against her own knowledge of the company's acquisition history, and a specific transaction was sitting in her memory with new and unwelcome clarity. 3 years prior, Brooks Meridian had acquired a small technology firm as part of a deal structured to accelerate the Aurora's development timeline. The transaction had been recommended by Garrett and processed through operations with a speed that had, at the time, read as efficiency. Coulter's name had not appeared in any of the materials she had reviewed. She had not thought to look for it. Coulter was not using this information to make a claim in the garage. He was using it to explain the car. The safety architecture running beneath the Meridian Aurora's operating system was a version of the framework he and Tessa had built, and it was behaving in exactly the way that framework had been designed to behave. It had identified a software substitution in the core security module and locked the vehicle as an automatic protective response. The substitute code installed in the 72 hours before the launch was detectable because it lacked the specific structural signatures of the original. Someone had replaced the genuine protection layer with a version designed to appear functional on a surface diagnostic while remaining open to remote deactivation. A vehicle running on that substitute code could be started, driven onto a stage, and then shut down on command at the moment of maximum visibility. On that stage, under every camera in the building, the shutdown would appear to be a catastrophic battery failure. It would look like Delaney had knowingly presented an unsafe vehicle. Garrett's response was immediate and sharp. He said Coulter was constructing a technical narrative to establish leverage for a spurious intellectual property claim, and that the board should be informed that an outside contractor was attempting to use a launch event as extortion. Whitney was composing something on her phone. Cassidy, meanwhile, had opened the acquisition documentation from 3 years prior and was reading the appendix attached as an addendum to the main contract, the section listing the technical contributors to the acquired firm's intellectual property portfolio. One name had been redacted. The redaction was not complete. Enough formatting remained to show the length and structure of what had been removed. Cassidy turned the screen toward Delaney. The space where a name had been was visible in the document's negative space, a ghost of an absence that was itself a form of evidence. The atmosphere in the garage changed in the way that atmospheres change when something concealed becomes impossible to ignore. The countdown showed 31 minutes. 2 floors above, 340 invited guests were performing the social choreography of waiting. Drinks held at the right angle, conversations calibrated between confident and curious, because that was what people did at a major product event while the product was being readied. None of them knew that the car was locked in a security state below them, being examined by a man who had been removed from the building 40 minutes earlier. Garrett understood that as long as the clock was running, a particular kind of pressure worked in his favor without requiring him to do anything other than let it accumulate. He approached Delaney with the urgency of a man who had been rehearsing the intervention. He said the investigation could happen after the launch, that Coulter's claims could be reviewed by counsel in the weeks ahead, and that the immediate priority was getting the vehicle onto the stage before assembled investors concluded that Brooks Meridian had a crisis rather than a product. He had numbers prepared. projected stock movement, contractual obligations, reputational cost per hour of delay. He wrapped every point in the language of concern for the company, which was the same frame he had applied to every consequential decision for 7 years, including the ones designed to destroy it from within. Coulter interrupted, not loudly, but with the directness of someone who had already calculated the cost of staying quiet. He said that the fallback code Garrett was recommending was not a solution, it was the mechanism. Using the substitute code would start the vehicle, but it would also disable the safety lock entirely, leaving the Aurora open to the remote shutdown command that was already scheduled and waiting. Whoever held the trigger would execute it at the moment of maximum exposure, on stage, fully lit, in front of every camera in the room. The failure would not read as a software glitch or a launch delay. It would read as an undisclosed battery risk, evidence that Delaney had presented an unsafe vehicle while concealing a known defect. The liability, the regulatory response, the recall process, those things would not be manageable in weeks. They would be permanent. Delaney stood in the center of the garage between two versions of the same evening. The version where she trusted the man she had already proven to herself she should have trusted 30 minutes ago, and the version where she trusted the man whose internal account was about to appear in a fraud investigation. Cassidy came to her from the diagnostic station and held up the tablet without speaking. The screen showed a log entry timestamped at 11:43 the previous night, originating from a Brooks Meridian internal credential containing a scheduled remote command set to activate at the precise moment the Aurora was due on the presentation platform. The credential belonged to Garrett Holloway. Garrett said his account had been accessed without authorization. He said it with the immediate fluency of a prepared statement, which was itself a kind of answer. Delaney looked at the entry for a long moment. Then she walked to the staircase leading to the reception hall and asked Cassidy to arrange a microphone. What she told the assembled guests was not the planned presentation. She said that Brooks Meridian was adjusting the structure of the evening, and that, rather than a standard vehicle reveal, they would be demonstrating the core safety architecture of the Meridian Aurora in its operational environment, and that an independent technical consultant would walk through the system's protective logic live, on screen, in full view of everyone present. There was a pause in the room above. Several people looked at one another. One of the journalists who covered automotive technology sat up noticeably. Coulter, standing at the bottom of the staircase when Delaney came back down, looked at her with an expression that was not gratitude exactly, but was something adjacent to it. The look of a person who has waited a long time for someone to make the right call and is genuinely surprised to see it happen. He tucked his jacket, picked up the diagnostic unit, and walked toward the stage ramp. Lydia, from her chair near the wall, said quietly, "Go on, Dad." He walked in front of 340 people in a jacket with a grease mark on the left sleeve and work boots that had not been selected for an audience. Several people registered his appearance with the involuntary social recalibration that happens when reality diverges from expectation, and a small number of them smiled the private smiles of people who expected to find this entertaining. Coulter did not look at the room the way a presenter looks at an audience. He walked to the vehicle with the same focused attention he had brought to every other moment of that evening. The attention of someone for whom the work itself was the only relevant consideration. He introduced himself without biography, his name, his role, and a single sentence about what he was going to show them. He connected the diagnostic unit to the vehicle's primary interface and fed the output to the main display at the back of the stage, which meant everything he was doing was visible to every person in the room at 12 feet high. The first thing the screen showed was two code structures side by side, the original core security architecture and the substitute version installed 3 nights prior. The structural disparity required no dramatic framing. It was visible to anyone who understood software architecture, and several of the technical journalists in the room were already writing. Garrett moved toward the presentation controls at the rear. Cassidy had anticipated this and had locked the display permissions before Coulter took the stage, standing near the panel with the composure of someone already 3 steps ahead. Whitney moved toward the side exit with her phone raised. A Brooks Meridian security officer, acting on Delaney's earlier instruction, positioned himself between Whitney and the door. Coulter explained the substitute code to the room without editorializing. It was designed to accept an initialization command, complete the startup sequence, and remain open to a remote override capable of forcing a full system shutdown at any subsequent moment. The person who installed it had understood enough of the original architecture to replicate its surface behavior while eliminating its actual protective function. This was not an improvised operation. It required admin-level credentials, deep familiarity with the vehicle's technical specifications, and advanced knowledge of what the original security framework was built to prevent. He then began the restoration, working through 4 layers of the authentication chain, reversing each substituted component and reinstalling the original logic from the reference file on his device. Near the end, the process required an authentication key embedded in the system's foundational design. Not a conventional password, but a structural verification signature encoded during the original build phase. Coulter entered it from memory. The system accepted it without hesitation. The vehicle's display powered on. This time it held. The startup chime, a sound none of the engineering team had heard during the 3 hours they had spent failing, filled the garage and carried through the open stairwell to the reception hall above. Conversations upstairs stopped. The Meridian Aurora rolled forward onto the presentation platform under its own power, and the 340 people watching it arrive went quiet in a way that was different from the anticipatory silence they had been maintaining. This was the quiet of people who had just witnessed something they didn't entirely understand and were going to be thinking about for some time. Coulter did not pause for the response. He activated the vehicle's diagnostic display and brought the scheduled remote command onto the main screen in full. The 11:43 entry, the activation timestamp, and the credential attached to it. The room's silence became a different quality of silence entirely. Garrett said, from the rear of the hall, that his legal team had already been contacted and that unverified internal data displayed publicly without authorization constituted a contractual breach. He said it with the fluency of a person reading from a document they had memorized. Then Vaughn Mercer entered through the side access with a case file and handed Delaney a document notarized that afternoon. It contained device access logs cross-referenced with credential records and remote command timestamps. The access had originated from a device registered to Garrett Holloway, not from the company network, from his personal account. Garrett did not break in the way that people who have absorbed their sense of how these moments go from fictional versions might expect. He did not raise his voice or make a panicked scene. He pivoted. He turned toward the investors and journalists with the controlled composure of someone who had spent 20 years understanding that the best defense against exposure is a counter-narrative delivered before the room consolidates its judgment. He said what they had witnessed was a staged performance by an outside contractor with a financial interest in disruption, that the intellectual property claims were unverified, and that Delaney Brooks had granted an individual with a personal grievance against the company access to a prototype, a presentation platform, and proprietary software data in front of their most important stakeholders. He made it sound like a governance failure. He made it sound like her fault. Whitney, held near the exit, managed to communicate something to a contact outside the building, and within minutes, a set of prepared materials began moving through the professional networks that covered the automotive industry. The materials had clearly been prepared before the evening began. They described a situation in which a disgruntled independent contractor had disrupted a product launch and made unsubstantiated ownership claims in an apparent bid for a financial settlement. The framing was professional and precisely targeted. It was designed to neutralize the story before Coulter's version could be independently verified. Coulter was standing at the edge of the stage when Lydia came to find him from the side entrance. She stood beside him and looked at the room, which was now divided into clusters of people in intense and anxious conversation, and she said, very quietly, that he had always told her not to let people write her name wrong. He had said it about school assignments, specifically about teachers who misspelled her name on documents, had told her that your name on a piece of paper is part of who you are, and you are allowed to correct it. She had stored that lesson without knowing, when she stored it, that he had needed to learn it himself and had not yet finished learning it. He looked at her for a long moment. Vaughn placed the full documentation package in Delaney's hands. The original patent filing, correspondence from Tessa during the development phase, a development log spanning 14 months, and the acquisition documentation showing how the core architecture had been incorporated into the Aurora's safety framework. There was no ambiguity in the record. The question was what Delaney intended to do with it. She could contain it, classify the documents through a private settlement process, issue a statement acknowledging a technical dispute under review, and protect the evening's narrative from fracturing further. Every instinct developed over 11 years in corporate environments pointed in that direction. She had also, in the past 90 minutes, seen exactly what happened when she chose pragmatism over accuracy, and she had a clear understanding of where that road ended. She went to the microphone. She said, to the room and to the cameras recording, that Brooks Meridian was immediately suspending its merger discussions pending an independent audit of the company's technology acquisition history, that the documentation raised questions requiring full review, and that the foundational architecture of the Meridian Aurora's safety system would be formally and legally attributed to its original developers. She named Coulter Briggs. She named Tessa Holloway. The room processed this with the particular attention that rooms give to statements that are more honest than expected. The board's response was swift. Garrett Holloway was suspended from his operational role pending investigation, effective immediately. Whitney Boone was placed on administrative leave. The acquisition group that Garrett had been negotiating with privately, whose offer, if accepted, would have removed Delaney from the company, issued a statement indicating it was reevaluating the terms. The garage was nearly empty when Delaney found Coulter. Most of the guests had moved to the lobby or left, and the Aurora sat on the platform in the particular quiet of a room where something significant has recently happened. Cassidy had taken Lydia to find something to eat, a departure with the tactful timing of someone who understood that certain conversations needed fewer witnesses. Delaney came into the garage without her communications team, without the professional framing she wore to every other engagement, and without the careful management of her own expression that had characterized the first part of the evening. She was tired in the unguarded, visible way that most people who knew her had not seen before. She told him that she owed him more than an apology for the evening, and that she understood that. What had happened in this building over the preceding years, the acquisition, the redaction, the removal of his name and Tessa's name from work that had been the product of real investment and real loss, was not something a statement from a stage could correct, and she was not going to suggest otherwise. She said this directly, without the qualifying language that would have made it more comfortable to deliver, but less honest to receive. Coulter listened with the stillness of someone who had practiced not speaking when speaking would have cost more than silence, for long enough that the practice had become a quality of character. He told her he had not returned for restitution. He had come back because the system he and Tessa had built was being used as the instrument of fraud, and that was a problem personal to him in a way that went beyond any financial consideration. Tessa had understood safety not as a regulatory requirement, but as a moral commitment, and using her work as the mechanism for Garrett's sabotage would have been a specific and intolerable betrayal of what the work existed to do. He said this, without elevation, in the tone of a person stating something simply and completely true. Delaney made her offer. She wanted him to return in a formal advisory capacity, to lead a comprehensive review of every safety system in the Aurora's production architecture before the vehicle moved to manufacturing. The foundational technology would be legally re-attributed, with his name and Tessa's documented correctly in all filings. A technical scholarship program would be established in Tessa's name, administered independently of the company's marketing operations. She said none of this reversed anything, but she would rather do it imperfectly than leave it undone. Coulter was quiet. The years he had spent away from this world had not been a retreat from ambition. They had been a choice, made deliberately, because Lydia deserved a father who was present rather than one who was distinguished. Delaney did not push. She said only that she didn't want the Meridian Aurora going into production running on a lie, and that she knew of exactly one person qualified to ensure it didn't. Coulter looked at the car. He did not say yes, but for the first time since she had met him, he did not move toward the door. The second launch event was smaller than the first by every measurable dimension. 4 weeks later, Brooks Meridian invited a significantly reduced guest list to a presentation that had been stripped of its theatrical lighting, its countdown clock, and the entire architecture of anticipated triumph. What replaced those elements was harder to engineer: actual transparency, delivered without a polished narrative beneath it. Delaney had decided, after several conversations with Cassidy and one long one with herself, that the company's most credible remaining asset was not the Aurora's design or its performance specifications. It was the story of a safety system that had refused to cooperate with deception, and that story, properly told, was worth more than a clean launch. She stood at the podium in the same garage where the first event had come apart and announced that the foundational architecture of the Meridian Aurora's core protection system was being formally designated as the Briggs Holloway Guardian Lock, attributed to Coulter Briggs and Tessa Holloway, and that Brooks Meridian was committing to a full audit of its technology acquisition history. Several investors were openly unhappy. Transparency in acquisition records creates complications easier to manage when kept private, and said so directly. Delaney replied that a car company could not build a reputation for safety technology on a foundation that involved erasing the names of the people who created it, and that she preferred the complications. Coulter was seated in the technical section in a row with 3 of the Aurora's lead engineers and Von Mercer. He was not on the stage. He had made clear when he agreed to the advisory role that his involvement in the public dimension of the company's activities would be limited, and that he was not available for the kind of narrative positioning that communications teams tended to treat as operational necessity. When Delaney said Tessa's name from the podium, the room gave it the particular attention that rooms give to a name being restored to a record where it had been absent. Coulter did not look up from the tablet in his hand for a moment. Then he did. Lydia, seated beside him with the small notebook that seemed to accompany her everywhere, reached over and took his hand without saying anything. She had learned, as children of quiet people sometimes do, that the most important acknowledgments don't require words. The Meridian Aurora completed its startup sequence cleanly and without hesitation, and rolled onto the platform with the easy efficiency of a machine finally operating in the conditions it was designed for. Delaney, from the podium, looked at Coulter across the room with the expression of someone who had arrived at a form of respect that couldn't have been purchased or negotiated, only accumulated through a sequence of events that had required both of them to be more honest than was comfortable. Lydia turned the notebook page so her father could see what she had been drawing. A car rendered from memory, with careful attention to the hood, and underneath the hood in her deliberate, unhurried handwriting, 2 names, one belonging to her father, one belonging to her mother. 3 months after the second launch, Coulter opened a training center in a converted workshop on the northwest side of Detroit, in a neighborhood that had housed automotive labor and automotive loss in roughly equal measure across the decades. The center offered technical certification programs for single parents and young people whose paths to engineering education had been interrupted by economics rather than capacity. Brooks Meridian provided the funding through terms Coulter had negotiated with Delaney in a 40-minute conversation. Operational independence in exchange for a co-branding arrangement that placed the company's name in the documentation, but not on the sign above the door. Delaney had agreed without extended negotiation, which said more about the past 4 months than any declaration she could have made. The center filled quickly. The first cohort included a woman who had spent 12 years repairing appliances and wanted to move into electric vehicle systems, a man who had worked at a dealership for 3 years and wanted to understand at a technical level what he was selling, and a 16-year-old who had been disassembling and reassembling electronics since she was 9 and had no idea there was a professional future in that compulsion. Coulter taught the morning sessions himself, in the same direct and unhurried way he brought to every technical problem, starting from the actual question rather than the anticipated answer, never using more complexity than the subject required. Delaney came to the center twice in those first 3 months, both times without a communications team or prepared statement. She sat through a session in which Coulter was teaching diagnostic sequencing, watched him work through a problem with a student who was frustrated and close to concluding the material was beyond her, watched him redirect the conversation from the student's conclusion to the actual data in front of her, and watched the shift on the student's face when logic that had seemed impenetrable became, in a handful of minutes, legible. Delaney had run a company for 11 years and understood effective teaching in an executive, abstract way. Watching it happen in this room gave her a version that was considerably less abstract. Coulter still drove the same truck. He picked Lydia up from school when his schedule permitted, which it now did more reliably than during the years when his invisibility had been both strategy and burden. Lydia had developed a habit of asking technical questions at dinner that were becoming increasingly precise, and Coulter answered them at full length because she was 8 going on 12 when it came to information she actually wanted. On the afternoon the Aurora completed its final pre-production verification, Delaney came to the garage where Coulter was running the last diagnostic pass, the same garage with its glass walls and architectural lighting built to impress and eventually used for something more important. She walked to where he was standing and said that on the first evening she had believed removing a variable was the same as resolving a problem. Coulter said that made sense, because that was often what control looked like from the inside. She said she had thought about that sentence often in the past 4 months. He put his hand flat on the hood of the Meridian Aurora, the same hood she had touched that first night, when the metal was cold and the car was dead and the countdown clock was the only thing in the room still moving. The metal was warm now. The startup sequence ran cleanly and without hesitation, The same sequence it had produced every time since the original code had been restored, because the system had been built for exactly this. The right foundations in place, no one asking it to run on something false. Lydia sat nearby, filling in the sketch she had made weeks earlier, adding color to the 2 names written below the hood in her careful, unhurried hand. Coulter looked at the car. The car that had refused to start until the truth was restored was now, without apology, exactly what it had always been built to be.
There we go. Oh, it definitely does that. Oh, my stamina's out. There we go. Yeah. Audio's perfect? Okay, cool. No, Nano. Appreciate you guys.